If you were listening to rock music in the 1970s, you had to have patience. I mean, you'd put on a record by Yes or Genesis or Rush, and you knew exactly what you were in for. You were getting a 20-minute song that took up an entire side of vinyl. You were getting songs about space, mythology, and fantasy. You were getting keyboard solos that went on forever and time signatures that required a math degree just to understand. I loved all of it. It was called progressive rock. And for a while, it was one of the biggest things in the world. But if you fast forward from the 70s to 1982 or 1983, those same bands that I just mentioned to you, they looked and sounded completely different. The capes were gone. The 20-minute epics were gone. The guys who used to sing about alien federations and medieval wars, they were wearing blazers and standing in front of neon lights on MTV playing 4-minute pop songs. And a lot of fans, they felt betrayed. They called it a sellout. So today, we're going to look at what actually happened to progressive rock in the early 1980s, because the truth is, the music industry changed overnight. These guys didn't just wake up one morning and decide to abandon their roots. They looked around, they realized that the meteor was coming, and they decided they didn't want to be the dinosaurs. So here we go. So to understand this shift, you have to look at what happened at the end of the 1970s. Two things came along that completely reset the board. The first one was punk rock, and then a little bit later you had MTV. Now, punk rock was really just a direct reaction against the excess of bands like Yes and Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and was definitely more direct and politically oriented than those type bands. Punk bands, they didn't care about technical proficiency on their instruments. I mean, they played 3 chords, they played them fast, and then they got off stage. They made progressive rock look bloated and out of touch. And the record labels, they noticed that. They started looking for music that was punchy, short, and direct. Then in 1981, MTV launched. Suddenly, you didn't have to just sound good on the radio, you had to look good on television as well. You needed a visual hook. You needed a single that grabbed people in the first 15 seconds or less, or they were moving on. So the environment that let a band spend months in the studio writing a sprawling concept album was dying fast. The record company, they wanted hits. And if you couldn't give them a hit, you probably weren't going to last too long. So the giants of the 1970s had a choice. They could dig their heels in, continue what they were doing, and fade into obscurity, or they could adapt. So let's look at Genesis. In the early 70s, under Peter Gabriel, Genesis was theatrical. I mean, that's an understatement. Gabriel wore outlandish costumes on stage, he even shaved the middle of his head to make him look like an old bald man. And the music was incredibly complex. But when Peter Gabriel left Genesis in 1975 and drummer Phil Collins took over the vocals, things started to shift. So by 1980, Genesis released an album called Duke, and it marked a turn. They started leaning into synthesizers and drum machines. The song Duchess was actually the first Genesis song that was built around a drum machine instead of Phil Collins playing live. Then in the next year, 1981, they released the follow-up to Duke called Abacab, and that change was even more dynamic and noticeable. They stripped away all the old prog instincts, and they started writing songs built around massive, simple drum beats and catchy hooks. You had songs like Turn It On Again and Abacab. I mean, they were smart songs and they were poppy, but they still had, if you were listening, they still had some odd time signatures if you were paying attention, but they disguised that complexity inside more of a pop format of songwriting. It was their Trojan horse. It was how they got on the radio, and they became even bigger than they'd ever been in the 1970s. Then you had Rush. Now, Rush is a fascinating case because they built their early career on ignoring what the label wanted. In 1976, they released the album 2112. At that point, they were in real trouble. Now, their previous album, Caress of Steel, had flopped, and their label, Mercury Records, was pressuring them to write something short and radio-friendly. But instead, Rush did what Rush does. They doubled down and they gave the label a sidelong 20-minute science fiction epic. It was basically a middle finger to their record company. But the ironic thing about that is that it worked, because 2112 became their breakthrough album, and it bought them the creative freedom to keep doing their thing their way for years. But by 1981, even Rush could feel the winds of change. They released Moving Pictures, arguably their masterpiece. I mean, Tom Sawyer is still a staple of rock radio to this day. It's incredibly challenging to play, but it clocks in under 5 minutes, which is direct for a Rush track. After Moving Pictures, though, Rush leaned further into the sound of the 80s decade, and on 1982's album Signals, they took synthesizers to a much bigger role in their sound, and guitar took a bit of a step back. The songs, they got shorter, more direct. They started writing about chemistry, suburbia, and modern life instead of the Solar Federation and Kubla Khan. So were they selling out? I mean, I don't think they were selling out. I think that they were bored of doing the same thing, and they understood that if they wanted to stay relevant, they had to evolve. But those two aside, the most dramatic transformation of all the prog rock bands of that era is the band Yes. If there was one band that defined the absolute peak of 1970s progressive rock excess, it was Yes. In 1973, they released Tales from Topographic Oceans, and that was a double album made up of just 4 songs, each one a full side of vinyl, adding up to about 80 minutes of music. Of course, the critics tore them apart. I mean, even their own keyboardist, Rick Wakeman, he thought it was padded and overstuffed and over the top. So by the end of the 1970s, that model had completely collapsed, and the band eventually broke up. But in 1983, they reformed around a new guitarist named Trevor Rabin, and they had their producer, Trevor Horn, come into play as well. Now, he had produced one of their previous albums and was also a member of the band for a short period of time, but this was a whole different ballgame. They released the album called 90125. Now, if you put that on right after listening to one of their 1970s albums, you wouldn't believe it was the same band. It sounded like the future, heavily produced, built on digital samplers, sharp guitar riffs, and heavy bass lines. From that album came the song Owner of a Lonely Heart. It hit #1 on the Billboard charts. The video was in heavy rotation on MTV. It was slick, it was, dare I say, danceable, and it was incredibly catchy. A lot of old school Yes fans, they hated it. They thought the band abandoned their soul for a paycheck. But here's the truth, at least the truth the way I see it. If Yes hadn't made 90125, they probably wouldn't have been remembered as a relic, or they would have been remembered as a relic of the 1970s. That album, 90125, it introduced them to a whole new generation of fans, and it kept the band working for generations. All this brings us to the ultimate rock, or example of 1980s prog rock pivots. In 1981, a group of musicians got together to form a new band. But these weren't just any musicians. These weren't kids. They were absolute heavyweights of the 70s prog rock scene. You had John Wetton, who had played bass and sang for King Crimson and was also in the band UK. You had Steve Howe, the legendary guitarist from Yes. Carl Palmer, who was the drumming powerhouse from Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and Jeff Downes on keyboards, who'd also come from Yes as well. So on paper, this band should have been making 20-minute songs about wizards, but instead, they formed a band called Asia. They looked at the music landscape, saw what MTV and radio wanted, and made a deliberate decision to write radio rock anthems. So in 1982, they released their debut album. And the lead single was the song Heat of the Moment. You know that song. Everyone knows that song. It was massive. It had huge guitar hooks, giant chorus. It clocks in under 4 minutes. The album Asia spent 9 weeks at #1 in the United States. It actually ended up being the #1 or the best-selling album of the entire year. The critics despised it. Of course they did. They called it corporate rock. They called it a cynical cash grab by a bunch of guys who used to be artists. But these were the same critics that were slagging Yes for doing what they were doing back then. So they couldn't figure out what they wanted. But I want to push back a little bit on whether this was calculated or not, because I think it was calculated. And was it a shift towards commercialism? Absolutely it was. But here's the thing. Writing a perfect 4-minute pop rock anthem that resonates with millions of people, that's incredibly hard. I mean, if it was that easy, I'd be doing it instead of talking to you on this video. Everyone could do it, but they can't. So the guys in Asia, they didn't forget how to play their instruments. They just applied their talent to a different formula. They tightened the screws, they cut the fat, and they created something that helped define the sound of the early 80s. But looking back on it now, more than 40 years later, it's easy to judge. It's the old Monday morning quarterback concept. It's easy to say Genesis, Rush, and Yes, and the members of Asia compromised their artistic integrity for fame and money. But that's a pretty naive way to look at it. The music business is exactly that. It's a business. The cultural landscape of 1982 didn't have room for 20-minute keyboard solos anymore. Attention spans were shrinking. The visual element became mandatory, and the rules of the game had changed. The bands that refused to play that game, they either disappeared or they faded off into the sunset, never to be heard from again. But the bands that survived, the ones we're talking about here, they were smart enough to adapt. They proved you could take high-level musicianship, you could package it into a 4-minute song and still make something great. They didn't sell out. They survived. So I'd like to hear what you think. Were the 80s a betrayal of the prog rock era, or was it a necessary evolution? Put your thoughts in the comment section below. Be honest, be direct, and let's talk about it. And if you enjoyed this video and aren't already subscribed, please hit the subscribe button, hit the like button, and share this with someone you think might enjoy this video. Thank you for watching. I really appreciate it. And until the next one,